Good evening and welcome. I'm Amy Sangiolo, Vice Chair of the Newton Democratic City Committee and Chair of the new Climate Crisis Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome everyone to another of our panels about the climate crisis. Whether because of the increased incidence of extreme weather, rising or warming seas, the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or any of 1,000 other reasons, people everywhere are recognizing that society has to change its relationship to fossil fuels. But what are the best ways of doing this? What is already being done? These are the questions we hope to address in our panels on the climate crisis. We hope to provide you with the information you need to understand solutions being considered or implemented so that you can choose to get involved as a voter, an activist, or as a consumer. Tonight, we will be focusing on housing. A 2021 analysis by the Newton Citizens Commission on Energy concluded that 61% of the city's total emissions came from homes and privately owned cars. Clearly, emissions from households and associated transportation must be reduced to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But the need to transform housing and transportation comes against the backdrop of pre-existing challenges to equitable and affordable housing access. Tonight, we have an impressive panel of experts to discuss housing, the climate crisis, and intersecting social and economic issues. Joe Curtatone, formerly the mayor of Somerville and now president of the Northeast Clean Energy Council, is our moderator this evening. Joe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Amy, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be participating and facilitating such a distinguished panel, but I also really honored to be participating, invited by the Newton Democratic City Committee and the Climate Crisis Subcommittee. So thanks you to Amy, Guy Rudzinski, Lucia, everyone for really elevating this topic. And I say that because, and I think you'll hear that flavor from the panelists, we all come from a either work or focus or work directly with municipalities. And it's really at cities and city regions where we're going to solve our challenges of the climate crisis and take on climate action. And it's really been at the municipal and regional level where worldwide you've seen the most practical, prudent, and bold and deliberate leadership on climate action, on housing crises, on transportation equity and public health challenges, and so much. We're in the fight for racial and social justice. And much like the title of this conversation has been put out publicly, it's truly important because it speaks to the intersectionality of the climate crisis and climate action to every important charge in our society. I often say in my new role, and I'm always a municipal person, I believe that's where the rubber hits the road, as we know. We have to see our challenges. We get to see it up close, and we have to implement policy to make things work. But never in our societal existence has there been such an important challenge, such as climate action, but inextricably tied, as often said, to business development and economic opportunity. The opportunity also to forge the third industrial revolution, if we do it right, leading with deliberate intentionality, with diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And that means focusing and recognizing our historic and systemic failures that, if we don't, will become barriers to achieving our climate action goals. So the issue of housing intersects and the housing emergency and crisis in the face of climate action and climate change intersects with so many things that touch us every day on transportation, on public health, on economic opportunity. And I'm excited to participate, and we're excited to hear your perspectives. And before I introduce our incredible panelists to help share their perspectives, a couple of things. If you have questions, we want to hear from you. Please feel free to start populating those questions into the chat function. And we'll make sure that we'll feed off that as we move forward. And your questions could be about anything you've teed up in advance, anything any one of the panelists, myself, say, or follow up. We'll try to get that. If not, get back to you after the meeting. We do have an 8:30 hard stop, and we want to leave a few minutes for wrap up. So without further ado, again, thank you again for joining us. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists, and I'll read a short bio. First, I'll introduce Dr. Atiya Martin. She's the CEO and founder of All Aces Incorporated, an alternative to traditional DEI consulting firms, as she is the executive director of Next Leadership Development, also a nonprofit focused on strengthening resilience and leadership within Black communities. Next, and for full disclosure, there may be a conflict here. He is also a friend and a former colleague in my school committee person, but he brings an interesting perspective. Mr. Andre Green has served on the Somerville School Committee since 2016. He is currently serving in his 4th term as chair. I can speak to his incredibly bold approach to leadership. His term in office has been marked by a focus on equity within Somerville schools, passing policies on racial equity, improving sanctuary city protections, and making groundbreaking protections in the protection of students and staff of non-binary nature. But he's also, since 2020, has served as the executive director of SkillWorks, which was founded in 2003 and housed at the Boston Foundation, and is a funder collaborative that brings together philanthropy, government, community organizations, and employers to address the twin goals of helping low-skill, low-income individuals attain family-supporting jobs and helping employees find and retain skilled workers. And finally, not least, Joan Fitzgerald. Professor Joan Fitzgerald is the professor of urban and public policy at Northeastern University. She focuses on urban climate action and strategies for linking it to equity, economic development, and innovation. In her 4th book, Greennovation, Urban Leadership on Climate Change, she argues that climate strategies of most cities and communities represent just random acts of greenness rather than integrated and aggressive action. She points to leading cities in North America and Europe and offers strategies for cities to accelerate their action. She is co-authoring a new book, Cities and the Struggle for Climate Justice. Professor Fitzgerald blogs on urban climate action on Planetism. So please join me in welcoming our incredible panel. And I'm going to kick it off, and I probably messed up the audio introduction. We're going to go Dr. Martin, Professor Fitzgerald, and Andre Green, so there's not too much of a Somerville influence at the beginning and favoritism. But if each of you could, in introducing yourselves, share your perspective as I sort of outlined the topic and the narrative, focusing on the intersectionality of your work to the challenge of climate action and on the housing crisis in terms of truly in a genuine way providing an opportunity for people to rent or own a home in the community, the challenge of producing more housing, and really those who rent a home or are housed here, the crisis they're facing of being displaced. So with that being said, I'm going to first kick it off to Dr. Martin.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you, Joe. And thank you all for being here. It is an absolute pleasure. The most important thing to know about me is that my husband and I were born and raised in Boston. We have 5 children, 2 still at home, and 4 grandbabies. So life is real, life is busy, and that is where I learned the most about resilience, emergency management, racial justice, trying to figure out how to just navigate day-to-day life, but also how do you raise 5.
I think we may have had a technical difficulty here, so
I'm still here.
Are you still here?
I think it must be Atia because we all seem to be here.
Atia's
I'm
back.
still
Dr.
here.
Martin's back. There you go.
Oh, did I freeze?
You froze right. You're talking about born and raised in Boston, so I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, so born and raised in Boston. My husband and I have 5 children, 2 still at home and 4 grandbabies, or 3 grandbabies and 1 on the way. And most of what I have learned about resilience, racial justice, emergency management came from those experiences in trying to figure out how do you raise 5 Black children in society, not designed for them to see themselves in certain ways, and to be able to not instill fear in them going out into the world, but also be realistic about how to navigate in that context. And so most of the work that I do on the business side really is about working with organizations on either their internal diversity, equity, inclusion work, and really what are some more transformational things that can be happening. But we also work on special projects. And I want to talk about one of the special projects that we worked on that are a couple that are directly related to this conversation. So one is that we created the social equity report as a part of the larger carbon-free Boston initiative in final report. And as a part of that process, most of us know that housing, buildings are the thing that are contributing the most to carbon in most urban areas. And we realized that at least in the city of Boston, there are most buildings, most homes need to be retrofitted. And we don't actually have enough people to do the amount of work that it's going to take to get us to meet our goals. The other layer on top of that is we also don't have enough businesses to be able to hire people to be able to help meet those goals. So it presents an opportunity that shows how the layers of opportunities are available for us with justice and resilience. And so one is when we think about housing and we think about the existing housing we have, what are some of the more creative ways that we can help folks expand and be able to have more green buildings, but also as we're building new homes and structures, how do we make sure that we are integrating the realities around having mixed income housing, because we need mixed income housing in this state, in this Commonwealth, in this area. We know that there are a number of issues that are historic around why we are in this situation in terms of the racial and social inequities that we're dealing with. And the other part of that opportunity is, how do we create the pipeline? So this is where it intersects with economics, right? And Andre will probably talk more about that. But how do we create the pipeline necessary to create the workforce that we need in order to be able to do the type of retrofitting that is necessary for us to reach those goals? And then finally, we also worked on an initiative with the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, which is part of a larger organization, the Watershed Association. And we focused on how do you do a climate vulnerability assessment that's not just focused on infrastructure? How do you layer in social vulnerability? And several things came out of that. Number one, there are some misconceptions, some widely held misconceptions about socially vulnerable populations. When we think socially vulnerable populations, we think of people who are not a part of society, they're not contributing anything, they're kind of off to the side. When in reality, through our research, surveying over 500 residents across 5 different cities and towns, we actually learned that at least 20% of our critical infrastructure workforce, let me reframe, at least 20% of the people who are considered socially vulnerable had jobs that were in critical infrastructure sectors, right? So just in that small sample size, 20%. And then when you look at the larger US data, you also see the intersection of the types of jobs that are held by race, by gender, and how those are also connected to critical infrastructure sectors. So what does that all mean? That means that there's a two-way interdependency when we're talking about what decisions that we're making about critical infrastructure investments, enhancements, mitigation, as well as the overall connection to economic development, overall connections to social justice. And so the bigger picture is that we know that yes, socially vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted by disasters, by climate change, but also that they are, if we don't address the issues, in addition to what we already know, if we don't address the issues of climate change in an equitable way and consider the demographics and the dynamics and disaggregate the data, we will not only be harming people's lives and livelihoods, we'll also be harming our interconnectedness in terms of the fact that folks are working in sectors that we all depend on, right? So there's both economic, social, environmental, governance in terms of people's voices being at the table as a part of these conversations. And then lastly, when we think about the other piece around housing, and I earlier mentioned the commonly held ideas or misperceptions or misconceptions. It oftentimes leads us to think that the people who are going to be living in the housing that is considered low income are a certain type of people. And we have a mental image of who those people are. And in fact, it's very misinformed because most people work in our society and most people are contributing. And in fact, those same very people are actually a part of our critical infrastructure that we all depend on. So I will stop there because I forgot to turn on my timer, but I'm going to stop there and I will hand it back over to Joe to transition us to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
Dr. Martin. And I'm going to hand it off. That was great. Off to Professor Fitzgerald to take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Atia. I was not born and raised in Boston, though I've lived here for 23 years. I guess I cut my teeth on focusing on equity in urban planning in the city of Chicago, where at the University of Chicago, we tried to keep the legacy of Mayor Harold Washington alive and his agenda for the city. Looking to our present crisis here in Massachusetts, addressing the climate crisis requires that we integrate policy on energy, housing and buildings as well, and transportation. We're not making our existing housing stock energy efficient fast enough. Atia hit on several, one key reason having to do with the workforce. But our recent assessment of Boston's climate action tells us that and looks at a number of different aspects of the climate problem in Boston and Massachusetts. One, we are not producing enough housing, let alone green, affordable housing. The Boston Housing Report Card that the Dukakis Center used to produce periodically tells us that every year. The MBTA is a mess, and the Boston metropolitan area today was ranked the 4th most congested city with respect to traffic in the country. And on top of that, we have a long-standing history of racism in the Boston area that has created the familiar pattern of affluent white suburbs not wanting to accept multi-unit housing because it will destroy the character of their communities that were built while denying that opportunity to Black residents in particular in the metropolitan area. So the question is, how do we change that? Our assessment of Boston for the Boston Foundation that was recently produced, one of our main conclusions is that cities can't do it alone. We need state and federal policy to support city action. So in many ways, I see the state level Housing Choice Act legislation passed in 21 as an attempt to do this. So the idea is that we build 283,000 some housing units near MBTA stations. Some people call this the transit-oriented development law. Transit-oriented development has been on the urban planning agenda for decades. It was promoted in the early 1990s by Peter Calthorpe, and the idea of TOD, as it's called, is to create dense, vibrant communities centered around transit stations, walkable communities. I'm sure most of you know the Housing Choice Act mandates well, but to summarize quickly, 175 communities across the state are required to create more residential development around stations. They have until the end of this month to file an action plan with the state that identifies the preliminary zoning strategy for compliance and a timeline for achieving it. The district must have a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre and be located at least less than half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station, and it must be 50 acres. Is this TOD and will it help the state climate goals is an important question to investigate. It is only transit-oriented development to the extent that the districts contain retail services that allow people to walk to get what they need, what is now being popularized as the 15-minute community, though this concept is hardly new. In fact, the promise of transit-oriented development, for reasons too complicated to get into in 6 minutes, is seldom realized, though we can point to Washington, D.C., Seattle, and a few other cities that have made it work. But a lot of communities don't want to do it. There's a lot of NIMBYism going on in response to the law. And the law does need some reworking. As Charlotte Kahn noted in Commonwealth magazine recently, it is a blunt instrument that needs revising. But that doesn't mean that suburban communities such as Newton shouldn't have their fair share of affordable housing. So what would it take for the law to achieve climate goals and affordable housing goals? First, it would have to require green housing. In my last book, Greenovation, Urban Leadership on Climate Change, I told the story of Tim McDonnell, a Philadelphia architect who decided to test whether he could build affordable housing to passive house standards. Passive house is one of the most rigorous energy efficiency standards for building. It requires almost no external heating. And what he did is not only demonstrate that he could build it at the same cost or very little over cost, but he could do that for ultra low income housing. And McDonnell became a zealot for getting state housing finance agencies to add points for passive house housing in rating their low income tax credit funding. Last data I saw in 2020, there were at least 38 states who have these passive house credits in their low income housing. So my point is, we know how to build green housing, green affordable housing, and states like New York are figuring out how to lead with low income housing. And we are figuring out how to connect that even more to climate goals with the 10 communities in Massachusetts that will eliminate fossil fuel connections in new housing, which is not only an important climate action, it's an important public health action. So developments like Northland Newton illustrate some aspects of this. It is built to a passive house or close to passive house standard. It will have 140 units of affordable or workforce housing, underground parking, underground utilities. It's not quite transit accessible, but there is going to be a shuttle as to part of it. So the point is, we know how to do it, or at least almost know how to do it. So my question is, why don't we use this legislation, revised as we all know it needs to be, as an opportunity to build eco-district or transit-oriented developments or 15-minute neighborhoods, whatever you want to call them, throughout the Commonwealth instead of fighting it? Obviously, the law would need some tweaking to make that happen. I just led a team that completed an assessment of Boston's climate action for the Boston Foundation. It identifies barriers that cities have to achieving aggressive climate goals. In addition to the summary report, we produced 4 big lift reports. And these identify key elements except transportation. We all know the MBTA is a mess, and we didn't want to tackle that at this point, that are needed to achieve climate goals. The first one looks at the electric grid. If we're going to electrify everything in our homes as well as transportation, that grid has to be updated. The second examines retrofitting to existing housing for efficiency. And again, Atia addressed some of those problems. The third focuses on a resilient coastline. But the last one that's near and dear to me is on what I call reparative neighborhood planning. And it points the way to some of these developments that point a pathway for connecting the interrelated elements of climate justice. I scanned projects in this report across the globe in Augustenburg and Malmo, Sweden, green zones, green justice zones in Minneapolis, Providence, and Oakland. Reparative neighborhood planning isn't just a strategy for frontline city neighborhoods. It needs to be how we think about creating affordable green communities in every city and town in Massachusetts. So let's start thinking of revising this law in a way that could make this happen, rather than focusing on how to prevent green affordable development in our suburbs and exurbs. I look forward to discussing these strategies when we get to that point in the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Fitzgerald, and I'll hand it off to Andre Green.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. It's always tough to go last in these introductions because so many of my points have already been touched on more eloquently than I would have done so by a panel that is just gobsmackingly brilliant. But I, like Dr. Martin, come at this work first and foremost as a parent. And as a parent of a 9-year-old who last year, walking her to school, after the first like snow flurry, asked when we were gonna get real snow. And I explained to her that it was gonna be probably later because winter in Boston starts later now because of climate change. And my daughter is smart, but I don't perhaps I use that term. So she asked me to explain climate change. I explained that because we had been bad stewards of the environment, winter in Boston literally started later than it used to. And she looked at me and she was like, climate change, coronavirus, racism. I'm like, yeah, kid, not necessarily leaving you the best planet. And that is, for those of us like myself who are elder millennials, who are parents, a stark reality. As an elder millennial, I'm a member of the first generation who will be poorer than our parents. But I'm also the parent of a generation that was born into a world where I can't even promise them a better world. And so we start from a place of trying to, how do we bend that arc of the universe back towards moral justice and prosperity for all. I have for my entire career focused on education and training as the key to unlocking that. I'm first generation college. It was my path out of poverty. I'm a strong believer in it. But what we've established here in Massachusetts is that we're actually pretty good at training people for jobs. If you look at Massachusetts, we are a leader in job training. We have the best education in the country. I put that in quotes because that's a conversation for another time. But if you also look at Massachusetts, low-income workers are worse off than they were 20 years ago. And whether we like it or not, that has a direct impact on everything else we do. As has been pointed out, housing and emissions are the two greatest causes of housing and transportation are the greatest causes of emissions here in Massachusetts. And the largest cause of vehicle emissions is people commuting to work. So it is therefore obviously an economic and ecological imperative to shorten the amount of time people spend commuting. Instead, Massachusetts, we're doing the opposite, especially for low-income workers, as they have been displaced, not displaced most recently from the urban cores, and they immediately hit a ring of suburbs they had already been displaced out of, as these suburbs were primarily creation of white flight policies of the 60s and 70s. And so racial justice also, therefore, becomes an environmental issue coming and going, because while it's absolutely true that low-income Bostonians and low-income Massachusetts residents are going to bear the brunt of the effects of climate change and environmental mismanagement, our policies towards those populations are also an increasingly driver of the issues of climate change and environmental management. As Dr. Martin pointed out, however, in my lifetime, in my daughter's lifetime, one way or the other, there will be a need for massive environmental economic shifting. Ideally, because we get proactive and do things we need to do to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But if we don't, we'll have to do the work to deal with the effects of that climate change. And as Dr. Martin pointed out, we're not currently equipped to do that. To help understand part of why that is, I want everyone to take a step back. Policy workers, like everyone else, we tend to get into fashions and trends. And so this is not the first time green jobs has been a real policy fashion. We want to go back to 2008, 2009. Actually, work that work brought me to workforce work. In the after effects of the Great Recession, the economic class of 2007, 2008, the Obama administration made the first real push to invest in green jobs. And well-meaning, did some short-term good, but it ultimately didn't pan out in a transformative way we hoped. Because what happened in that first wave of green job investments is that we didn't pay attention to job quality. So we produced a whole lot of, frankly, bad jobs, a lot of weatherization jobs that didn't end up creating career pathways, that frankly weren't paying social sustaining wages, and didn't actually create the infrastructure for a green future that we needed. Our challenge before us now is to actually do that. It's to make sure that we are creating sustainable careers in sustainable neighborhoods for all populations. I think that's my 6 minutes. I think I was stop there. We'll get into it.
Well, you all did very well staying on time. So I remind everyone, and I'm starting to see the chat column populate with some questions. I'm going to ask the first one and frame it in this way, because for context and just in summary, there's an important question, can we meet our climate action goals and issues like the housing crisis? I'd submit yes, and what's holding us back. And I think Joan touched upon this, but everyone made an important point here. If you look at Metro Boston, no matter where you live, Somerville, Newton, we say we're from Boston, it's really the metro region. It's 101 cities and towns. The one thing we get lauded for, and Dr. Martin and I had this conversation earlier, is the uniqueness of Massachusetts and home rule, and each municipality having that sort of autonomy, which really isn't true, and the myth of home rule, and that's great. No, it's not, because we don't have we belie the tenets of regionalism. And if I'd ask each of you to talk about this, because as I think about how we're going to meet our climate action goals without regional collaboration, and not just statewide, but how we're going to meet our housing goals when we don't have a housing plan. The Housing Choice Program, I was chair of the Metro Mayor's Coalition and worked with Marty Walsh and others and Governor Baker. That was supposed to be one tool. At that time, we already knew we were at least 400,000 units of housing short in the metro area, not just Somerville, Cambridge, Boston, Newton, of what we needed. And yet we failed to do anything. How are we going to compete in the 21st century global economy? Even though the Green Line opening summer, we're still running mostly on Nixon era infrastructure. And that, and in a pandemic, trust me, lack of regionalism doesn't work. You can't have 351 cities and towns doing their own thing. Although I want to commend Newton and the Democratic City Committee for elevating this conversation. I think Professor Fitzgerald brings up a good point. We all have a responsibility, whether you're an affluent suburb or you're within the urban core and the very inner core, of playing a role in this. So if each of you could touch upon from your perspective, because now we might be the fourth congested region in the country. We were number one before the pandemic, and I'd submit because the population shifting out, if you haven't read the data, people are leaving Massachusetts, affordability issues, congestion, and a lack of a modern transportation system, and the inequity in that is causing our most skilled and diverse and eclectic workforce to be displaced more remotely and more intensely, compounding our climate action and climate challenges. So that's a long context, but I'd start going back to Dr. Martin from your perspective. If you respond to that or have a thought on that, and we'll go right down the line.
That's a
and
lot.
you were in the city of Boston. You were a municipal person. You understand fully what I'm saying.
I know what you're saying. So it's funny because so many places in the country do have a regional construct. And when I go other places around the country, it's hard for them to wrap their brains around how we operate in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and in, the other New England states that have a similar structure. And so there are benefits that come with thinking more regionally and collaboratively and collectively about approaching issues. So number one, I think part of the opportunity is, in reality actually, is we are living in a world where everything we do impacts every other jurisdiction, right? Like that is the reality. But we don't operate as if that is our reality. We plan, we take action in ways that are very focused on our jurisdiction. Now, don't get me wrong, there are regional collaboratives and specific initiatives that folks work on, specific issues to collaborate and things like that. But in reality, how we're thinking big picture about the challenges of climate change, the realities of what it's going to take for us to, number one, reduce the impacts of climate change, but number two, to be able to actually have the infrastructure necessary to respond to the inevitable increases in disasters that we are already dealing with, actually. And so this opportunity to think more collectively about those challenges is, in an ideal world, we would have better infrastructure to support that happening. I think in Massachusetts, for us, the other challenge is, you said it, and you used the language of myth of home rule. And so it's like people think that there's more benefits to it than there really are. And so there's this clinging to an ideal that is not what people actually are getting in return. So those are preliminary thoughts. And then the last thing I'll say is, for folks' edification, there's a great book called The Sum of Us. If you have not read it already, it's brilliant. It helps to break down some of the mental constructs that we collectively have about how we need to deal with equity and justice issues, and reframing a lot of that context for us to see the shared struggle. And what I'll say, it's not necessarily in the book, but it's connected. This idea that the perverse inequities that we see in communities and across communities is not by accident, right? Like statistically, if you shook up the numbers and throw them on the table, it's a statistical impossibility that it would end up like that randomly, right? So there's this historical context, there's the social context, and then there's these behaviors that we continue to do. And when we see those inequities, what it's really telling us is red flag. There's a problem with the way that we are structured, the way our processes are set up, and there are some major things that we need to do to change them. Because what you're seeing is the disproportionate burden of those inequities because of historical context and social context, but the disproportionate burden of the brokenness of systems and structures that we depend on, like public administration. It's broken for everyone. It's just worse for communities of color, for immigrant communities, for poor people. And so if we can't wrap our brain around the shared struggle, the shared issues that we're dealing with, and this relates back to the book, The Sum of Us, we're missing the fact that we breathe the same air, we drink the same water, right? All of these are shared resources. And so just because it's in somewhere else happening, it's upstream, well, it's gonna come downstream. And so just to think differently about the context of how we think about the environmental issues and climate change issues, but also how we think about the problems of how the housing crisis and all of these other pieces, they're symptoms of a larger issue that is impacting all of us. And when one of the things that I've seen oftentimes is low-income housing, that language. People misunderstand. A lot of times low-income housing is going to people who are professionals because they can't afford regular market prices. That's how bad the housing crisis is right now. And if we can't connect these dots of the fact that these are regular people who are struggling just like you, and you have this reality of how are we going to see the collective struggle so that we can take collective action. If we can't see the collective struggle, we get into our isolated silos, and then we start doing things in these siloed ways. So thank you very much. And I will be quiet now.
Joan, on this point here, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, are the days of incentives like housing choice, are they gone? I mean, we put it on cities and towns? Newton's asking itself, what is the role we're supposed to play here? And like many other communities here, how do I play a role? Why is the burden only on us? when we've gone to a disincentive structure like housing choice, rather than deliberate leadership from the state to put in the governance structures to achieve our goals. I mean, are we ever going to get there without the states? And I know you've spoken about this, so I'll let you answer.
Yeah, let me just start, again, with this idea of the myth of home rule and local power. And, in Massachusetts, of course, that power is with the legislature, and many, many home rule petitions just languish for years. And many of those are preventing climate action and other types of action in the cities. And to this topic of regionalism, yeah, we're a metropolitan area, but the fact of the matter is our political entities are cities and towns. And, Minnesota has these tax districts that are regional and redistribute funds. There's a reason that hasn't caught on in 40 years like they do it in Minnesota. And so the idea that there's some, regional, definitely, I agree, problems are regional, but until those political boundaries coincide, we're not going to get regional solutions, which is why state solutions are so important. So in terms of housing, I don't know quite, what you're referring to, Joe, in that, but that's why I think there needs to be a state approach that takes this idea that, okay, each city and town has to do its fair share. And I've seen a couple comments quickly in the chat about, well, how do you do that? What would be the tweaks to this law? And I think I spoke a little bit to that in my first comments, but that it has to be at the state level that we say, okay, we have to distribute this, but not just we have to distribute affordable housing, particularly in Massachusetts, where we have the very vulnerable Boston coastline. We really have to start thinking, and the lack of affordable housing, how do we use public transit to create opportunities for cities and towns in Western Massachusetts? How do we think of that's the smarter place to prioritize development, given the coastal vulnerabilities? And how do we structure that transit-oriented development to those cities and towns, and think about what are the economic development strategies for those towns? I don't know if I quite answered your question. I wasn't quite sure what you were alluding to in my work.
No, actually you did. And I want to clarify, because there are, in the legislation and housing choice, there were incentives, but there were deliberate things by the state to remove barriers by municipalities. And listen, the majority of the countries like Massachusetts, small to medium-sized communities, like Somerville and Newton, and many don't have the administrative infrastructure, but there have been barriers, whether they're racial or cultural or historic, where 2/3 of an attended body can stop an affordable housing project. So those were deliberate statewide action. And I'd also agree, the state has the ability, without creating region entity, to get rid of the underlying zoning that is the basic zoning code that has been the basis of housing, the failure to achieve our affordable housing or goals, or create more housing stock. So Andre, I want to pivot to you, and you can add this. Just from your perspective, you're in the through the lens of creating, tying a skilled workforce to the jobs of the future. That runway is long and wide, and when we think about transition to a clean energy economy. But as you think about that, there's a question in the chat, how, I think, if we touched upon this, when we think about that and achieving our climate action and affordable housing goals, what comes forth? Is it the affordable housing? Is it the good transportation, or the dense housing? We could share your perspective.
Sure. I'm going to say, when in doubt, choose both. This is an all hands on deck situation. We can't say we can't start chicken and egg. You got to do both. Whatever opportunities we have, we should seize. I will, however, point out to for Cheryl's point that Massachusetts is a tiny state. We don't think of it as such. Those of you, especially those of you who were born and raised here, Massachusetts is a tiny state physically. I went to college out in Western Mass, and when I grew up in Louisiana, and I first went to Western Mass the first time, Western Massachusetts, they're like, oh, it's 120 miles to Boston. And I figured I would be in Boston every weekend in college. I went once in 4 years. And I said that, you know, it's almost a joke to say that we have a third of the state with lots of jobs and no housing, and 2/3 of the state with lots of housing and no jobs. But in theory, if we were to invest properly, it should be possible to live in Pittsfield and work in Plymouth. It's not that far away. That said, that does not preclude the need to have more housing closer to Boston for all the reasons we just discussed about shortening commutes, being better for the environment. What we have found in our work to prepare people for the jobs of the future is that job training is very rarely the barrier that is the one thing that gets people over the line. When it is, we do it, we get it fine. But what tends to be the problem is they'll be like, oh, there's a great job, but it's on the Cape and I can't get there. Or, you know, there are jobs in the service sector in Newton, but the nearest housing is an hour away. And when you factor in the cost of getting to it, I won't actually make any money. And so we have to stop thinking, as we have for 100 years, as a field is part of the Great Depression. And it's based on this idea that people who don't have jobs are broken somehow. If we can just get them any job, they can then rise by their bootstraps and they just show gumption, they'll be fine. And if that was ever true for people who aren't straight white men, it hasn't been true for anyone in my lifetime. So key to creating jobs of the future is what we call in my office the social determinants of work. It is access to affordable housing. It is access to quality to transportation. It is access to childcare. You know, if we learned anything from COVID, it is childcare is a workforce issue. And it can't be, oh, we're going to pick one of the three. Everyone has to be looking at all three. And to the points, maybe I want to make one point about the political points that my predecessor just pointed out. So if you allow me to put my school committee hat on for a second, I'm going to use school committees in Massachusetts as an example of the political structures at play. I spent 2 years as the chair of the Urban Schools Division for the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, which represented roughly 15% of the member districts of MASC and educated 70% of the students. But in the MSC voting model, every district has an equal vote. So 30% of the students were represented by 85% of the voting, about 85% of the votes. And that political structure replicates itself in issues of housing, in issues of transportation. Like the city and town model and the lack of regional governance and the lack of these things is intentionally designed to make sure that urban districts cannot dominate political structure of the Commonwealth. But it also is intentionally designed to make some of the urgent action needed to make it denser, create density, create 15-minute neighborhoods harder to do.
Thanks, Andre. There's a few questions here. I'm going to tie these together and we'll go right down the row, and I'll try to use my what I acquired for some political skills to put them together. But one was directly to Dr. Martin about, and this was from Kathy Pillsbury, that you had mentioned the importance of creating mixed income housing. And could you speak to that? I'm going to hold off on all this, going to add and go right down because I think they're very tied together. Another one from the chat is, how is affordable housing created? Who funds it? And another one from Cable Eames is the affordable housing crisis we created by markets, and now we are building more to create and designate affordable housing. Addressing runaway capitalism is part of the solution. I want to just set the context and get your reaction how these all tied. So let me just say, the federal government got out of the housing business and funding a long time ago, and we're starting to see that. We're seeing that consequence. We've been seeing it for years. Secondly, as a municipal official who, along with Andre and other leaders in the region, have been pushing investment in affordable housing, we cannot rely on the private sector alone to solve that problem. However, tools such as inclusionary and housing and our zoning code, or linkage fees are important to fund affordable housing programs. But we don't want to have, and the only issue I have with just focusing on transit-oriented areas is gated communities where all the people can achieve in affordable housing is much more. It's the middle class that's really gone away, because in Somerville, if you want to buy a 2-family home that needs $900,000 worth of work, you're still going to pay $900,000 on top of it, right across the street from me. The other, we want to make that a genuine, authentic choice. We have to preserve the housing market, the stock that we have, and create other opportunities. But not everyone's going to live in that sort of high rise in parts of Somerville or Boston or Newton around the transit station. But there are important tools, but we cannot rely on the private sector. We are going to need public funding from the federal government and the state, and the federal government needs to get back in that business. That has certainly compounded a problem. When you have several 100,000 units of housing stock coming out of the Great Recession that we needed to build with an increased population, as we're trying to build our economy, and this is important as we think about building a new climate economy, those collide to exacerbate a circumstance. And the other part, and I just want to get to Cable's point about capitalism. Yeah, we should think about community and shared capitalism. I'm a capitalist, but it's not, only a few people are capitalizing on capitalism in my town and Andre's town, because there are even development companies from out in the Midwest who are all over our city buying up the 2-family and scattered single-family homes and monopolizing them. So even and they're paying cash over asking price as is without inspection. So even if you qualify for a loan, you can't even get in the game in our city because they're paying cash as is and scooping up the housing. So that is runaway capitalism. So as we step back and think about all these things, the importance of mixed income housing, not having gated communities, who funds it, and the role that capitalisms have gone out of check play in this, I could ask each of you if you could to comment on that, and even especially from the perspective of the work you're doing, whether on skilled workforce or the DEIJ work. Dr. Martin, I'll start with you again.
Thank you. That's a lot.
A lot of questions.
So first, let me explain when I say mixed income housing. So right now we have projects, developments that are called low income developments, but they're not for low income people. The numbers that they use to determine who's eligible, oftentimes there are a lot of folks who even in the prices that are available, like they can't afford those prices, even though it's considered low income. And it's pushing a lot of people into other areas. Or what happens is they say they're doing mixed use, and they'll have like 3 real low income units that folks can afford, and all the other units are market rate. And so we have to do a better job of thinking more systemically about how we're putting housing in, and think about how do we make sure that people who are integral to our workforces across the Commonwealth, but particularly in this part of the state, are able to actually afford to live in the areas where they work. To Andre's point earlier, people are commuting from very far away. People who used to live in Boston, who've been pushed out of the city, are traveling by public transportation, mostly driving, because public transportation is not reliable enough to get to work on time. And there are folks who you can't show up, you can't be late. If you are late, they will dock your pay. Just that simple. And so we have incentivized several things. We've incentivized more carbon by our inaction. We've incentivized more segregation. We've incentivized investments in projects that are harmful to the actual people who live in the communities, who've been living in communities. And I'm using Boston as an example because that's where I live and I grew up, but this is a dynamic that's happening across the region. And so as I'll also explicitly say that as we think about workforce development, that we also have parallel to that entrepreneurial development. I was supposed to say that earlier, and it's right here in my notes, but I just didn't say it. But it's an important concept because we know that we have this huge wealth gap, and we have a whole series of historical and well-researched and documented moments that have led us to that point. But how do we make sure that as we're looking at building more housing, addressing transit issues, we're also making sure that we are supporting businesses that are owned by people of color. We're helping folks transition into different industries who either have businesses or used to have a business, to be able to really participate in this green economy in terms of a truly just transition. And then how do we make sure that folks are able to access the resources available to retrofit their homes? Most people in our areas are renters. So how do we navigate those dynamics of these realities of making sure that folks have access? And when we're thinking about all of these different pieces, last thing I'll mention is digging deep in my brain for this one. Back in the day, in the 90s, I used to work at Initiative for Competitive Inner City, which was started by Michael Porter from Harvard. And his research really laid out what are the different business clusters that you need to have in a particular area for it to thrive, right? And so as we're thinking about businesses, what is the research telling us about the types of mixture of things we need to have in an area for it to be vibrant and sustainable? What kind of housing units do we need to fill in the gaps in the areas that we need in terms of income level, accessibility? What are the transportation issues that we need to address? And how do you overlay all of those things in a way that is a cohesive strategy and not creating false choices in a way that is unproductive or counterproductive?
I know, Joan or Andre, you want to comment as well, or also move on to the next question? Go ahead.
So you asked about, particularly when you think about like, I want to talk about capitalism, particularly when it comes to the workforce, right? It is not a surprise that a lot of the same forces that have driven property values up have the same forces driving wages down, right? I think it's important to remember to your point, Joe, about the federal government getting out of housing policy. That was a conscious decision, and it's a conscious decision that was replicated in a lot of places in the 70s and 80s. And it goes back to institutionality, right? Like, we got out of public housing. One, public housing ceased to be a white benefit. We got out of funding education properly once we were told we have to educate Black people. We got out of job training because it used to be that, you know, especially for the baby boom generation, the idea was you'd go to high school, you'd get a job with a company, they would train you, and you would stay with them. Once the labor market was freed up that you didn't have to stay with them, they stopped training. And somehow, over the last 40 years, Reagan convinced society that it was actually the public sector's job to train employees. And you know, so as we have in so many places in our society, we have a place where we have socialism for the rich and rugged pull your street capitalism for the poor. Now, I am fortunate that it's part of also thinking of, like we said, when we looked at the incompletion of the last green job revolution, it has led to I think a new focus this time around, and the timing couldn't be better because one lesson learned from the pandemic on job quality, right? One of the things you'll hear people say that I loathe with a passion is there's such a thing as a bad job. This is a dirty lie. There are lots of bad jobs, and we're creating more all the time. If a job just leaves you less poor, it's a bad job. If a job still means that you were dependent on government benefits to make ends meet, it's a bad job. If a job doesn't provide opportunities for growth, development, dignity, and the fulfilling your potential, it's a bad job. And so absolutely, we aren't going to get where we need to go. And it's one of the reasons that increasingly workforce development has taken things like unionization as a wage growth strategy. It is why we are tackling social determinants of work. We recognize that if we want people to, because we are in a capitalist society, work their way to prosperity, there's a whole suite of tools they're going to need to get there.
So, your Professor Fitzgerald, before, if you're going to answer now, I'm going to ask you to kick it off, and feel free to carry on the answer to that. A question from Kate M, which I'll ask each panelist to briefly give a comment on. And Kate says to me, if state solutions are the way we need to go, I think we'd agree there that we need state solutions in addition to others to solve dual challenges of climate action and affordable housing as a region. What state programs would each speaker propose that would be most beneficial to both of these challenges simultaneously? And I'd ask us to put that also in the context of how does that help a locality like Newton and their advocacy on this topic. So, Joan, I'll give it to you first, and to others.
Okay, but let me go back to the question, before that we've been working on, looking at comments about, well, the markets have created, the lack of affordable housing. I think we can't underestimate how much government has colluded in that. And I'm sure many here have read The Color of Law, that really looks at the courts and their decisions and government decisions in redlining and historically that have created the segregated system of housing that we have. And so we've got governments, can either support that kind of racist policy, that kind of exclusionary policy, or government can take a role in trying to make more housing, more affordable housing, more workforce housing, and not segregating that housing. And so what are the tools available? I see in some of the comments, people have talked about rent control, which, is limited and it only has to do with renters. We have land trusts at the local level that have been used effectively in Boston and Nubian Square. But this whole system of the low income tax credit from the federal government, and that's how we build affordable housing, that is broken. And so I think we need to totally reconsider it at the federal level. But the fact of the matter is, look what's going on in the House of Representatives. That's not going to happen anytime soon. So we really do have to look to the states. And I think, we are in this unique moment in Massachusetts where, at the city level, at the state level, we have progressive government that really wants to make this happen. So what are some of the small reforms? So, for example, Boston has talked about increasing the percentage of low-income units that have to be created as part of large development projects. I think as long as we're still allowing developers to pay into a fund where you can build it somewhere else, so those people don't have to be part of that development, we're not going to get it. And that's one of the first things I would do. When you have a stipulation, it has to be, whether it's 15%, 20% low income, that means on site. That's the only way you're going to get that mixed income, mixed race housing that we value. And so I think it's not exactly the solution we need right now, but I think the housing law at the state level, with some tweaking that I've talked about earlier, is the way to go to distribute that. And so then there were questions in here about, okay, is it better at more subway stops than commuter rail? Massachusetts is a really small state. And again, going back to my Chicago experience, going from one end of the city to the other, if I went that far in Massachusetts, I'd be into the exurbs of the city. So I think for climate adaptation reasons, for economic development reasons, we have more of an ability to try to connect those Western Massachusetts towns into a whole statewide economy, and transit has to be at the core of that, and the idea of transit affordable housing. So I'm still thinking that, an adapted version of that law is the way to go in Massachusetts.
Thanks. And Dr. Martin and Andre, I don't know if there's one solution
Sure,
that's
I
not
was
to be
gonna,
complete, you'd point to?
I was gonna echo Dr. Fitzgerald, like the most important workforce issue, and I think the most important environmental issue, for some important affordability issue facing the new governor is fixing the T. And by fixing the T, I don't mean getting it to safety, which yes, absolutely needs to be done. But as Joan points out, the idea of trying to decide between more subway stops and more commuter rails is fundamentally a false choice. The commuter rail, or that rail line needs to run so frequently that the way you do the subway, you go to Union Station in Worcester, and you don't have to try to top to the time because the train's coming within minutes. We need to accept that even if you don't live on a T line or a commuter rail line, that massively expanding that service is in your best interest, because that should be the default way of moving around the T area, freeing up the roads for the people who don't have that access. But again, to Joan's point, it should be possible to take reliable, efficient, fast mass transit from Pittsfield all the way to Boston and everywhere in between. This is not a big state, but that's expensive. And this is the thing. All the solutions we need require people who have historically not seen mass transit as their issue to understand that investing heavily in mass transit is in their best interest. Like those in Somerville, we can up and down for expanding the T. It's not going to happen until people in the suburbs and the exurbs say this is a good use of our taxpayer dollars.
And
Can I just make one point in response to that, Andre? And you're right, and I agree in terms of statewide. But let's just look at Boston. So during the entire fall semester, I lived in Paris. I never waited more than 3 minutes for a train. Okay, government works.
There was a tweet.
And people care about government. And so here we have a system where, particularly at the federal level, the idea of is just government's ineffective, tear government down. And so, I come back to Boston from my station, Mass General, to get to Cambridge. I have to wait 18 minutes for a train. And so no wonder people don't use public transit. On the way back from Cambridge, I got the 18-minute signal. I ran out and got a taxi, and I was home in 15 minutes. Yeah. That was door to door. And so there's no faith in government being able to do anything at the federal level. We're trying to just, not we, Republicans are trying to tear down government. And so we've got to show that government can deliver. And right now, our T is not delivering at all, and in Boston and the metro region, let alone getting it out to Pittsfield.
Yeah. But I would add to that, and for those who live outside 128 or 495 and say, what do I care? Well, the Metro Boston region, 101 cities and towns, contributes 80% of the gross economic activity for the whole Commonwealth. If the T goes down, the region goes down, we all go down. So you better be damn well concerned about it, is what I would tell people. And if we're going to meet our climate action goals and affordability challenges, we need a system. We need to have reliable, as you've mentioned, affordable, equitable, sustainable choices of transportation. And it doesn't have to be a light rail system. It could be electric BRT, which we can easily do if there's a will. But absence the will, and I say the Green Line in Somerville, it was advocacy and activism got it done. It wasn't the state. You take that to the bank. And then we have a couple of questions I want to get to the end, and then really put a focus on what we want to leave Newton. And it's not just Democratic City Committee for conversation. Yeah, I was coming to you to add to that point as well. And then we'll go ahead. On you, Dr. Martin. It's all you.
Just very quickly, I just want to reinforce a couple of things and then bring up a couple of things. So one, I want to amplify Professor Fitzgerald's points around the low-hanging fruit incremental changes that we can make. She named a number of them. I also want to highlight the more transformational types of policies and shifts that we need to make, to Andre's point, around the whole public transportation system needs to be revamped, right? That there's a level of transformation required there in order for us to have a sustainable economy, meet our climate action goals, and a whole number of additional benefits. This piece around how we are able to confront racism. And I'm just going to explicitly say it. So, oftentimes because we're in, progressive Northeast, right, Massachusetts, it's harder sometimes for us to see the ways that racism happens here, right? So people think racism, I'm intentionally targeting someone, I'm intentionally being a bigot, I have made some conscious choice. When in fact, most of the mental food that we have digested, whether it's from media, whether it's from family, friends, reinforces a lot of problematic ideas about who people are and how they're supposed to be, what they deserve, what they don't deserve, what we should expect from them or not expect from them. And the problem with us, with our challenges with confronting and really looking in the mirror to see how is it playing out here? What are the ways that it's happening in terms of oftentimes we're talking about people of color and we're not explicitly saying so. We have lots of euphemisms. We have all types of words, but that's who we're talking about. And it makes it harder to disaggregate data. It makes it harder to really talk about the root causes of those issues. We often talk about people without them. We have convenings. We talk about people of color. There's folks who are experts on them. And in reality, what we really need to have is people's voices at the table speaking for themselves, and not just kind of academics, but also people who this is their lived experiences. They have been thoughtful about it from I grew up at this intersection. When we talk about intersectionality, we've been talking about it in the context of kind of housing, climate change, and transportation and other relevant economic development issues. But intersectionality in terms of who we are as people and the way that race layered on top of whatever identities you have changes the dynamics of the experiences you have and actually creates a whole different one. And so our ability to confront the range of realities that we're dealing with in terms of what we are doing to avoid ourselves and the things that we have inside of us that are influencing how we interact or don't interact with people, the policy decisions, and even the way we frame problems. There's a whole shift that we have to make in order to be able to do true justice to what it means to, I'll speak from a public administration perspective, what it means to really do good public administration. And in the opportunity we have is that there are actually 4 pillars of public administration. It took 20 years for the 4th one to be added, actually over 20 years for the 4th one to be added. So it's supposed to be economics, like we're supposed to make economic good choices. We're supposed to be able to be efficient with whatever we're doing and that folks get what they need, how they need it, as quickly as they need it, and our processes are efficient, that we're effective. We actually accomplish the goals and outcomes that we're seeking, and that we are embedding equity. We never talk about that. It's not it's a pillar. It's not an option. It's not a nice thing to do. It's a pillar of public administration. And so our ability to, as folks who are outside of government, now that I'm outside of government, to hold government accountable to all 4 pillars, and in the overlay of equity on all the other 3 pillars and all the work that we're doing. And what I will charge level up is that we actually are dealing with justice, right? Equity is about distributive justice, how we distribute resources. Justice gets to those other issues I was dealing with about people's voices and choices being heard and all those other aspects. So I'll stop there and just say we have big issues with racism in this Commonwealth. People leave this state, people leave Boston because of the experiences they have and the way racism works here. It's different. And so I hope that we're able to also reconcile with that.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Folks, we have about just under 15 minutes left, and at most 2 more questions. I'll ask our panelists to be brief in their response. I want to bring it back to Newton, what we hope to leave Newton with, and celebrate the fact that advocacy and activism in Newton is alive as one community, trying to understand how do we reconcile these challenges. So first, I have a question from Manir Azam, and his question is to all the panelists. That he's been building a business at Greentown Labs dedicated to developing holistic clean energy climate solutions for communities. We are finding project opportunities that are showing solid, if not compelling economics, and we are in fact running into other significant barriers to implementing these projects. I'd love to hear from each of the panelists as what they see as the first most significant barrier or barriers to overcome to attain widespread rapid implementation. If we could be brief in those responses, and I want to get back one more directly for Newton and then closing comments. So we'll go rapid fire. Andre, do you want to go first? We'll go Andre, then Jones, and Dr. Martin.
So I think that the most significant barrier is going to be to, Mr. Martin said, most people here are renters, and we haven't figured out a way to involve renters in the process of adopting new practices.
Joan?
So I think, is Munir asking about the barriers to renewable energy development?
I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah.
But
And so for right now, I think it's the utilities, right? And the utilities really aren't on board. So with things like, eliminating fossil fuels in new development and so forth, that's a big part of it. I think we're going to see a lot of slowdown of renewable energy development related to land use conflicts. Already in Western Massachusetts, they're not happy about large-scale solar farms. We rely on those as an equity issue for community solar in Eastern Massachusetts. And so there's a lot of land use conflicts on renewable energy development, and related to the utilities, how they think about the grid and our ability to modernize the grid in order to be able to absorb the renewable energy we have.
Okay. And Dr. Martin?
Very quickly, I would just say you're absolutely right, Munir, that the ESG, or environment, social, and governance structure that corporations use is, as it currently is structured, is problematic, and isn't actually achieving the goals that we need them to, including the ultimate goal that it promised it was supposed to have for corporations. So I think, to your point, where can we fit into that in terms of bringing government into this, corporations into this conversation? I think there's a lot of work to be done around community, academia, and representatives from corporations to come together to reshape this ESG piece, to embed some justice in there, and to really get to the social part of it, and have more meaningful measures that are also have qualitative inputs.
Thank you. So in these final 10 minutes, and I saw Monia has a clarification, then we'll respond back to it. First, before we head into closing comments, I want to get, and these closed comments really think about what we can leave Newton with as food for thought, to continue. And we want to commend them and celebrate them being probative and curious about the role this municipality should be playing and how they can advocate for that. And we need more and more communities to do that. So we thank you for that. And thank you to the Newton Democratic City Committee and the Climate Crisis Subcommittee, and Amy and Lucia for your help today, and Gary as well, but all of you attending. Feel free to reach out to us if you have more specific questions. But with the 10 minutes left, I want to allow each panelist to really tie in the conversation. We've been speaking at a level here at times, now local, but I'd submit the challenges that Newton's facing, we are all facing as communities across the country, trying to understand what is our role and how do we take it on. And that's healthy. And so it's not unique to Massachusetts, but we have an opportunity here. Crises do present opportunities really to meet our climate action goals, and as well as our other challenges around racial social justice, housing, transportation, public health, and forge that third industrial revolution, as Jeremy Rifkin has constantly pounded the drum on. If we do it right and we lead deliberately and intentionally, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, are we willing to do that? So the panelists, and I'll go right down the line the way we started with Dr. Martin and to Professor Fitzgerald and Andre Green. Thank you for joining us. If you could leave some thought for Newton locally about what they can take away and how they might want to approach the work ahead of them. And hopefully there are more conversations and we're participating in them. First to you, Dr. Martin.
I will just say, I will leave you with a quote. One of my favorite quotes in the whole wide world: most people don't recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. And I got that quote from a Salada tea bag. Wisdom comes from lots of places. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Practical and powerful. Professor Fitzgerald.
Yeah, well, again, I would look at whether it's Newton or any other community, how do you fit in to a state policy that is trying to correct a lot of these problems? And going back to this housing and zoning MBTA communities. So a lot of places are fighting it in a NIMBY way or pointing out correctly that, okay, we've got a lot of dense communities. Why are the same standards being applied to them when there's other places that could absorb more? But not just to be fighting it, but to look at what is our responsibility in this and how do we fulfill it? And so I use the example of the Newtonville, it's in the chat, of saying, this illustrates some of it. Of course, it's got a lot of problems too. But how do we anticipate as a community, whether it's Newton or any others, okay, this is coming down the pike, it's happening. How do we do it in our community in a way that shows some leadership, as opposed to just saying, I bought into this community because this is the way I like it, this is what I wanted to build in, and recognizing how many people didn't have that opportunity. And again, going back to redlining and not being able to accumulate wealth, and realizing there's some responsibility in that to create those opportunities for other people rather than just protecting what you have in community. So I think it's, part of this thinking of the other, and really thinking about what's the best way to integrate the affordable housing into this transit goal that the state has.
Thank you, Professor Fitzgerald. Andre?
So Newton's former superintendent, David Fleischman, recently took over as president of JVS Boston, probably the best job training program in the country. And he and I had the good fortune last summer to discuss different types of equity leadership, right? And I think about it a lot because, in Somerville, I can't be progressive enough, right? Like, we have that constant fight to try to one of each other and who can be bigger than now. And that's great, that's important, it helps shift the window. But if we're going to see this kind of state policy changes, we all need to see that's not where that's going to come from. I think, Newton, you have a unique opportunity to use your privilege and to use your place amongst other suburbs to really lead to Joe's point, a movement to recognize that some of your privilege and some of your position is a choice of inequitable politicians in the past, but to say that inequity stops with us, that we are going to commit to ourselves and to our peers to challenge the systems that got us here, that you may have benefited, you individually or collectively may have benefited from. But, at its core, if you aren't supporting dense walkable neighborhoods in your own communities, you aren't actually an environmentalist. I hate to be the one to give you that bad news.
Well, I'm going to pass it on in just a second to Amy to sum up. Thank you all again. But I referred to this book at the beginning. I'm going to take another quote out of Metropolitan Revolution. As cities, I'll say as municipalities lead, nations follow. And municipalities lead not just by those in transactional authority who are elected to office like I was or Andre is, but your advocacy and activism. So much I get lauded about what we did in Somerville was because 81,000+ people, led on a value narrative. And that's what I see as an opportunity here for Newton, along with other communities. We certainly need the state to be a player and a partner in so many things in the federal government, but you don't have to wait for that to lead. Leadership is born by the type of community we all want to cultivate and collectively aspire to be, the values that lead us. And if we truly believe in the tenets of equity, diversity, justice, and sort of that collective compact, then we take that baton and we run with it. So I have no doubt that can happen in Newton. The fact that your advocacy has led to a conversation tonight is really important. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us. We're happy to provide context and resources. We all are big, passionate lovers of municipalities and local government because honestly, that's where it all happens. And that's who should be elected to the highest offices in the country, in my opinion. So thank you for having us. And to the Democratic City Committee, I'm going to hand it back over to Amy. And big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Wow, I really hate to see this amazing panel come to an end. Thanks, Joe, for moderating this extremely stimulating conversation. And thank you to our incredible, thoughtful guests for sharing your wisdom and experiences. Extra special thanks to co-chair Gary Rosinski for organizing this and all of our other panels. If you enjoyed this conversation, please keep an eye out for more in this series in the future. Thank you everyone for coming this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again at future climate crisis discussion panels.